I really wanted to see him like this.
I had a rule, just one: never get involved with the boss. Seemed simple, but then he came along, with that look that seemed to undress me without even trying, that voice that reached me before any words did, and that suit that had no right fitting a human being that well. I followed the rule, until the day I forgot he could be listening, and said, out loud, to my best friend, that I dreamed about him naked, and that I really wanted that dream to happen again. He was right behind me, and that's when everything fell apart. Chapter 1. The Day I Shouldn't Have Spoken. I had a rule, just one, and for 8 months, 2 days, and about 14 hours, not that I was counting. I had followed that rule with a discipline that bordered on heroic, never the boss, simple, reasonable, the kind of thing any person with minimal self-preservation could maintain. And I had managed it, despite the suit he wore on Tuesdays, despite the voice that arrived before any words did, despite the fact that once he had leaned over my desk to grab a report, and I had to mentally count to 10 to keep from doing anything that would cost me my job. 8 months, 2 days, and about 14 hours. And then came a Thursday in March, at 6:40 p.m. The office was nearly empty at that hour. Most of the team had left after 6, and the floor had that strange quietness corporate spaces gain when they lose most of their people, wider, colder, full of pushed-back chairs and monitors in power-saving mode. I was finishing a report that technically could wait until Friday, but that I had promised myself I'd deliver today because it was the kind of useless promise you make when you need to have control over something in your own life. I pushed back my chair, grabbed my phone, and called Pippa. It was what I did when I needed a human voice that wasn't from a coworker. And Pippa Souza, my best friend since college, 25 years old, zero filter, always answered. Hello, she said, with that tone of someone settled on the couch with no intention of doing anything else for the rest of the night. Are you still in that office that smells like corporate ambition and bad decisions? I'm finishing a report. That's a yes. She paused deliberately. Is he still there? I knew immediately who the he in that sentence was. Pippa had shown up at the office once, 2 months ago, to drop off lunch I'd forgotten at home. She had crossed paths with Kyle Ferrante in the hallway for maybe 4 seconds. 4 seconds she never forgot, and that I could never ignore again, because Pippa had turned those 4 seconds into fuel for every conversation since. No, I didn't know if he was or wasn't there, but that was the safest answer. He left early. You're lying. I'm not. Your tone got 2 degrees more defensive when you said he left early. She was clearly pleased with herself. Vesper, you need to tell me something. I have nothing to tell. You work with the hottest man I've ever seen wearing a suit in my entire life for 8 months without telling me absolutely anything, and I'm supposed to accept that. 8 months and 2 days. I said, before I could stop myself. Silence. Then, that doesn't mean anything. You're counting the days, Vesper Adler. I'm counting time employed. I closed a browser tab harder than necessary. That's what employees do. They count time employed. You weren't counting when you worked at Hartwell and Moss. Hartwell and Moss had poor ventilation and a manager who chewed on pens. And Kyle Ferrante has a face that looks like it was sculpted by someone angry at all the other beautiful people in the world, she said, drawing out the words. You know what I think? I think you think about him, frequently, at inappropriate times. Pippa, like during meetings. Stop, like when you're trying to sleep. I'm not continuing this conversation. Like when you dream, she said, and there was something in the precision of that tone that made me stop typing. Have you dreamed about him, Vesper? The silence that followed was too long to be innocent. I felt it before I could do anything about it. That's irrelevant, I said. That's a yes. Her voice went up an octave. Dreamed what, exactly? Absolutely nothing, I'm going to tell you. Did you dream he called you into a meeting and asked your opinion on the quarterly proposal? Pippa, I swear. Did you dream he was wearing a suit, Vesper? Or did you dream he was without a suit? Shut up. Without a suit, she concluded, with the enthusiasm of someone who just solved a case. Without anything, maybe. Look at me. Did I get it right? I looked at the ceiling, then at the computer screen, then at the empty hallway in front of me, with its rows of deserted desks and lighting slightly dimmer than during business hours. There was no one there. I was sure. I'd heard the elevator close for the last time at least 20 minutes ago. Fine, I said, in a tone of voice I hoped conveyed this was just information, not a confession. Yes, he's irresistible, okay? He's the type of man who walks into a room and you stop thinking about what you were thinking about, because he occupies the entire space, without doing anything. I think about him at the most inappropriate times, in the middle of meetings, in the coffee line, at 11 at night when I should be sleeping. And yes, it may have happened that I dreamed about him, without clothes, and it may have happened that this dream was the kind you don't want to wake up from, and it may also have happened that in the moment I woke up, I thought I would really like that dream to repeat itself. This doesn't mean anything, doesn't change anything, and if you repeat this to any living being, I'll never speak to you again in my life. Pippa took a second to respond, the kind of second where I should have realized something was wrong, but I didn't. Vesper, she said, with a voice strangely contained for her standards. You're alone in the office, right? I am. I already said that. You sure? I turned in my chair. Kyle Ferrante was standing about 3 meters away from me, briefcase in hand, and tie slightly loosened. The way he looked at the end of the day when he thought no one was watching anymore. He had come back. I don't know when. I don't know how long he'd been there. But from the way he was looking at me, calm, absolutely calm, with that expression that gave nothing away except the fact that it gave everything away. I knew it had been long enough. The earphone fell from my ear. He tilted his head slightly. "We can do it live," he said, with the voice of someone commenting on the weather outside. The last coherent thought I had was that the floor was rising toward me in a way that wasn't normal. I woke up on the couch in the conference room. It was the gray couch against the back wall, the one people used when they waited before an important presentation. I was lying on it with a jacket folded under my head. It wasn't my jacket. And there was a different quality to the lighting because someone had turned on only the indirect lights instead of the overhead ones. Kale was sitting in the chair farthest from the table, about 4 meters away from me, briefcase propped on his knee and phone in his hand. He wasn't looking at me when I opened my eyes. When he noticed I was awake, he raised his gaze with that same expression as always, impossible to read, impossible to ignore, and said, with a naturalness that made me want to disappear from the face of the earth, "Want some water?" I stared at him for a few seconds. My voice came out slightly hoarse. I cleared my throat. How long was I? About 3 minutes. He stood up, went to the side table where there was a water bottle and a glass, and placed both within reach of my hand with a gesture that had nothing dramatic in it, as if people fainted in front of him regularly and he had developed a protocol. No apparent after effects. I asked the doctor on the floor to come up, but you came back before he arrived. There's a doctor on this floor, second floor, the whole building technically. I sat up slowly, picked up the glass of water, and drank because I needed to do something with my hands. He had returned to the distant chair, 4 meters away, as if he had calculated how much space would be necessary so I wouldn't panic when I woke up, or faint again. The silence between us was the kind that occupies space physically, like something you need to breathe around. I looked at the wall, at the table, at the glass in my hand, at anything that wasn't him. "Kale," I said finally, with the most professional tone I could muster in 30 seconds. "About what you heard. You don't need to explain anything today. I want to explain. I know." He was looking at me with that calm that never seemed like effort to him, never seemed like performance. "But it doesn't need to be today." I closed my mouth. He picked up his briefcase, stood up, and walked toward the door with his slow, controlled stride as always. Before leaving, he stopped, without turning around. "Go home, Vesper. The report can wait until Friday." The door closed. I stayed there for a time I couldn't measure, with the glass of water in my hand, and my head trying to process the entire equation. He had heard. He had said that in that voice. I had fainted. He had waited for me to wake up, given me water, left me 4 meters away, and spoken as if we were discussing the week's agenda. As I lay down that night, I concluded there was only one reasonable interpretation for all of that. He was going to act like an adult and pretend nothing had happened. The next morning, he would be the boss. I would be the assistant. Life would continue as before. It's what happened with mature, professional people who understood that certain moments were better left behind. The next morning, I was called to his office at 9 o'clock sharp. And when I walked in, and he raised his eyes from the screen to me, calm, absolutely calm, with that specific weight I was still learning to recognize, I realized he wasn't going to pretend absolutely anything. Chapter 2. Elevators will never be safe again. The meeting lasted 4 minutes. He asked me to review the Mori client presentation before lunch, looked at me with that expression that gave away absolutely nothing, and that was it. Mori client presentation, deadline by lunch. I left the room with the file in hand and the slightly humiliating feeling that I had prepared myself for something that didn't happen. I returned to my desk, convinced I had misread his expression from the night before, that it was exactly what it seemed. A boss requesting a presentation review, adult, professional. The incident from the day before was properly buried where it deserved to be, in a locked drawer, at the bottom of the ocean, on another continent. That conviction lasted until 10:30, when he passed by my desk on his way to the conference room, stopped for a second, and said, without looking at me, with his voice low enough that only I could hear, "Do you take your coffee black or with milk?" I looked up from the screen. "With milk," I said, because it was the true answer, and my brain hadn't processed the question in time to invent another one. He nodded slightly and kept walking. 2 minutes later, Liev Orkin, Kale's right-hand man, former personal security, man of few words and no identifiable facial expressions, appeared beside my desk with a coffee with milk and left without saying anything. I looked at the cup. Then I looked at the conference room, whose walls were glass and through which I could see Kale sitting at the head of the table, listening to someone speak, with that contained attention he had for everything, as if the whole world needed to prove it, deserved 5 minutes of his time before receiving them. He wasn't looking at me, but he had sent the coffee. I stuck a new post-it on my monitor that same afternoon, in capital letters, with blue marker, "Never the boss." The problem with Kale Ferrante's provocations was that they weren't the kind you could classify as harassment or annoyance or anything that would justify a conversation with HR. They were surgical, calibrated. A question here that had nothing professional about it, but could perfectly seem professional if someone heard from outside. A comment there that sounded neutral in any context, except to someone who knew the context. A look that lasted 1 second longer than it needed to. Not 2, not 3, exactly 1, as if he knew that 2 would already be too much, and 1 was enough to do the damage. On Tuesday, he stopped beside my desk to ask if I had slept well. Well, I said. Great, he said, with a tone that made it impossible to know if he was being ironic or not. You seemed tired yesterday. I fainted yesterday. That explains the tiredness. He kept walking. On Wednesday, during a meeting with 3 other team members, he asked my opinion on the European market entry strategy, and when I responded, with data, with arguments, with the firm voice of someone who had prepared that analysis, he kept looking at me for a second after I finished, with that closed expression that gave nothing away, and said only, "That," and moved on to the next item on the agenda as if nothing had happened. 2 seconds, a single monosyllable. And I had to drink water before continuing to speak, because my throat had decided that wasn't a good time to function normally. In the women's bathroom on the 12th floor, Thursday morning, I looked at myself in the mirror and said out loud, with the clarity of someone making a formal declaration, "You work for him. He's your boss. You have a rule. The rule exists for a very good reason, and that reason is that you don't want to destroy your career, your sanity, and your ability to go to work without feeling like the floor is tilted. Never. The boss." The woman in the mirror didn't seem totally convinced. Pippa called on Friday at 11 in the morning while I was crossing the hallway toward the copier. "Spill," she said without preamble. "I have nothing to spill. Vesper, you disappeared for 2 days. You only disappear when you're processing something. What happened?" I looked both ways down the hallway. Empty. I lowered my voice anyway. "He's been provoking me all week," I said quickly, in the tone of someone reporting a crime. "Questions that aren't questions. Looks that aren't looks. He sent coffee without me asking." "Coffee," she repeated, as if I'd said he'd sent me a diamond ring. "It's coffee, Pippa. People send." Vesper Adler. "This man heard you confess you dreamed about him naked, and his response was to send coffee. This isn't provocation, this is courtship. It's not. This is the corporate equivalent of flipping your hair in front of someone. You're being hit on by your boss, and you're here telling me about—" I had to leave the hallway. I went to the emergency stairwell, opened the door, and stood there on the concrete step, pretending I was coughing, while Pippa completed her reasoning with an enthusiasm that would have been more appropriate in a football stadium than in a Friday morning phone call. It took me 40 seconds to convince her I needed to get back to work. Another 20 to convince myself. The post-it stayed stuck on the monitor all weekend long. The following Monday, I had to go to the 20th floor to get a signature on a contract Kale had urgently requested. The 20th floor was where the financial management was. Bigger offices, darker carpet, the kind of environment that seemed to constantly be holding an important meeting even when it was empty. I took the elevator back with the signed contract in hand at 4:30 in the afternoon. The doors were closing when a hand appeared in the gap and stopped them from closing. Kyle got in. He was wearing the gray suit I had mentally cataloged as the most inconvenient of all, not because it was more beautiful than the others, but because the gray on him did something I couldn't explain, in a way that sounded rational. He looked at me. I looked at the button panel and pressed 12, as if it were the most fascinating thing I'd done in my life. The doors closed. The elevator began to descend. Kale stood half a meter away from me and said nothing. I held the contract with both hands and said nothing. The silence was the kind that has temperature, not cold, not hot. Something between the two that makes it hard to breathe at a normal rhythm without it seeming like you're making an effort. 3 floors. 4. The elevator descended slowly, because it was the building's old model, which management insisted on calling classic, and which everyone knew was just slow. He moved. Not much. Just enough that the distance between us decreased from half a meter to something I couldn't measure without looking at him. And looking at him was exactly what I was trying not to do. I felt the heat before anything else. The kind of heat a body radiates when it's too close, and you're too aware of it. 6 floors. 7. Vesper, he said, with that voice. I turned my head. It was a mistake. He was exactly where I had calculated. Too close. Dangerously close. His eyes held me with that expression that revealed nothing, and at the same time gave everything away. Before I could form any words, before common sense could interfere, he placed his hand on the wall beside my head, tilted his face with deliberate slowness, and kissed me. It wasn't a hesitant kiss. It wasn't a kiss that asked permission or left room for doubt. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, the kind that starts dominating and ends making the other person surrender completely. His lips took mine with a contained hunger, elegant and voracious at the same time. His hand moved slowly up to my face, his thumb pressing gently below my chin while his fingers spread along the line of my jaw, tilting my head exactly how he wanted it. The contract slipped from my fingers and fell to the elevator floor with a dull thud that echoed between us, but the sound barely registered in my mind. Stopping was no longer an option my body recognized. I didn't resist. I responded. My hand found the lapel of his suit, pulling him closer while my breathing accelerated, hot and irregular. I felt the exact moment he realized the effect he had on me, the slight smile that formed against my lips, the way his body pressed more against mine, trapping me between the cold wall and his solid heat. My heart was beating so hard I was certain he could feel every beat through the thin fabric of my blouse. The kiss deepened, slow and intense, tongues meeting in a rhythm that made my legs weaken. A low sigh escaped my throat and he captured it, devouring it as if it were the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. The elevator stopped with a soft ding. The doors opened on the 12th floor, revealing the empty, lit hallway. He pulled away with the same calm with which he had approached. He looked at me for a second, with a face that had returned to being the same as always. Closed, impossible, elegant. Then he bent down, picked up the contract from the floor, and placed it in my hand. "That was a mistake," I said, with my voice slightly different from normal. It was the only sentence I had available at that moment. He considered for a second. "It may have been," he said. "It was the best mistake I've made in my life." A pause. "I don't regret it one bit." The doors began to close. He stayed in the elevator. I stayed in the hallway with the contract in my hand, and the certainty that the post-it on my monitor had completely lost the battle it never admitted it was fighting. In the days that followed, I avoided Kale with an efficiency that would have been admirable in any other context. I routed my trips to the main hallway to times when I knew he was in meetings. I answered emails with the objectivity of a technical report. I sent everything that needed his approval through Liev, who received the documents without comment, and returned them without comment, with the expression of someone who had learned not to ask questions about certain things. Kale didn't push, didn't insist, didn't send another coffee. But he didn't disappear either. He showed up where I was with that naturalness that could be coincidence if I didn't know, deep down, that he wasn't the type of man who left things to chance. And every time our eyes met, in the hallway, in a meeting, in the floor kitchen when I went to get water, there was something in him that didn't need words, and that precisely because of that was impossible to ignore. By the end of the first week, I realized I was losing. By the end of the second, I realized I had lost. The question was just when I was going to admit that to myself. Chapter 3. One night was a lie from the start. The solution came on a Tuesday at 2 p.m, while I pretended to review a spreadsheet and was actually counting how many times he had passed through my field of vision in the last 2 hours. 4 times. 4. And he hadn't said a word during any of them, just passed by, with that slow, controlled stride that occupied the entire hallway in a way that seemed purposeful, but probably was just how he walked, because some men were born that way, as if the space around them was an extension of their own body. The solution was simple. It was logical. It was the kind of thing I should have considered days ago, when I still had more control over the situation. One night. Get it out of my system. Done. It was what people did. They built it up to an unbearable point, resolved it once and for all, and then the system returned to equilibrium because there was nothing pending anymore. Like an open file you close. Like a browser tab that was consuming memory unnecessarily. Simple, efficient, no after effects. As long as both parties understood the conditions from the start. I was good with conditions. It was my strong suit. I went to his office at 3:20 and knocked twice on the door before opening it. Kyle was on the phone. He looked up when I entered, said something in English to whoever was on the line, and hung up with a brevity that was probably rude, but didn't seem to bother him. He kept looking at me in silence, with that patience that never seemed to cost him anything. "One night," I said, standing in front of the desk, with the voice I used in presentations for important clients. Direct, without hesitation, without room for misinterpretation. That's it. No conversation about what it means. No involvement afterward. No change at work. You treat this as a closed item and I do the same. Clear conditions from the start. He was silent for a second. Just one. "All right," he said. I had prepared myself for resistance, for negotiation, for some comment with that subtle irony he used when he wanted to destabilize without seeming like he was trying. I hadn't prepared myself for all right said with that irritating ease, as if I had proposed a meeting time and he was confirming his availability. "All right," I repeated, because I needed to verify I had heard correctly. "All right," he said again, with the same tone, and there was something in his eyes that I couldn't read in time before deciding it was better not to try. We left the office separately, as I had requested. He sent me the address by text. No additional text. Just the address, and I went there by taxi, with my coat closed and the conviction that I was making an adult, rational decision that would solve the problem once and for all. The building was glass. Of course it was glass. It was in the Upper West Side, 70-something floors of mirrored facade that reflected the Manhattan sky as if the building itself thought the sky was an inferior version of it. The receptionist was expecting me by name, which meant he had notified them in advance, which meant he had planned in advance, which I decided not to analyze because it would lead to a conclusion that would destabilize the logic of the entire plan. The apartment was on the 53rd floor. When the door opened, I immediately understood what he meant when he had said "all right" with that ease. It wasn't indifference, it was confidence. It was the kind of man who didn't need to negotiate, because he knew exactly what was going to happen. And the apartment was the physical version of that certainty. Cold, impeccable, absurdly beautiful. Exposed concrete walls and floor-to-ceiling glass. All of Manhattan outside like a backdrop that had cost more than most people earn in 10 years. Dark furniture. Clean lines, no unnecessary decorative elements. It was the interior of a man who didn't tolerate excess in any form. In the center of the room, the table was set for dinner. 2 glasses, an open bottle of red wine. He had prepared dinner. I looked at the table, then at him, who was standing near the kitchen with his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, which was, objectively, inconvenient, looking at me with that same calm as always. "You said one night," I said. "You didn't say dinner." It was almost 8 at night. He moved toward the table unhurriedly. It seemed rude not to offer. "Rude," I repeated. "Sit down, Vesper." I sat down. The dinner was rigatoni, with tomato sauce and fresh basil, which he had made himself, which was information I hadn't asked for, and that my brain refused to fully process, because it needed to maintain focus on the terms of the agreement. The wine was a Barolo I didn't know, but that had that taste of something that ages well, full-bodied with a finish that stayed on the tongue longer than was convenient to think about. We talked, not about work, about other things, the ones that come up when the wine is good, and the city is out there and no one needs to play any specific role for a few hours. He asked me where I was from. I said I had grown up in Portland, that I had come to New York at 22 with a large suitcase, and the conviction that the city owed me something. He didn't laugh, but something in his face changed slightly, the way it changed when he found something genuinely interesting and didn't need to say so. "And you," I said afterward, "did you grow up here?" A small pause, almost imperceptible. "No," he said. "I came from elsewhere." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask, because there was something in the way he said from elsewhere that made the question unnecessary. It was the tone of someone who had left some place behind intentionally, and who felt no need to elaborate on it. The tension between us during dinner was the kind that doesn't disappear with conversation. On the contrary, conversation fed it, because each exchange revealed a new angle of someone I had spent months trying not to look at directly. And the harder it became not to look, the clearer it became that the plan's conditions had a fundamental flaw I had ignored when drafting them. You can't treat as casual something that was never casual from the start, but I wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet. When we stood up from the table, the city was dark outside, and Manhattan's lights had that specific quality of late night, more sparse, more distant, more beautiful because of it. He went to take the glasses to the kitchen, and I stood near the window, looking outside, with the wine still slightly present, and the very clear awareness that I was about to execute the entire plan, and that there was a part of me that already knew the plan had failed before it began. When he came back, he stopped behind me. He said nothing. I could feel his presence before any touch, that specific heat, that gravity he exerted without doing anything to exert it. "Vesper," he said. Low. I turned. He was closer than I had calculated. Or maybe I had moved without realizing it, drawn by that silent gravity that always existed between us. His eyes held me with a raw intensity, without masks, without performance. It was just him, looking at me as if I were the only thing in the world still worth seeing. When he raised his hand and ran his fingers across my face, the touch was surprisingly light, slow, precise, almost reverent. His fingertips slid across my skin as if they were memorizing every line, every curve, every reaction I couldn't hide. A treacherous shiver ran down my spine. I understood, in that instant, that I had lost this battle long before entering this building. He leaned in and kissed me. This time it wasn't like in the elevator. It was slower, deeper. His hand remained on my face, his thumb caressing the outline of my lower lip before he captured it between his. His other hand found my waist, sliding possessively along the curve of my hip, and pulling me against his body with a firmness that left no room for doubt, but also with a dangerous patience, the patience of a man who knows he has time and intends to savor every second. I tasted the red wine on his tongue, rich and slightly bitter, mixed with the heat of his mouth. My hands rose to the front of his shirt, my fingers gripping the thin fabric as if it were the only thing keeping me standing. All the accumulated tension, from the last weeks, the last months, from every stolen glance, from every unrequested coffee, from every unspoken word, surfaced all at once, like a hot dammed wave finally breaking through the barrier. A low moan escaped my throat when he deepened the kiss, his tongue sliding against mine in a slow, deliberate rhythm that made my entire body respond. I felt his chest vibrate against mine with a hoarse sound of approval. His hands descended a bit lower, gripping my waist harder, pressing our bodies together until there wasn't a single inch of space between us. I could feel his heat through the fabric, the growing hardness pressing against my stomach, the evident proof that he was as affected as I was. My legs went weak. I held on tighter to his shirt, my fingers trembling slightly as they rose to his collar, brushing the warm skin of his neck. He broke the kiss just enough to breathe against my lips, his voice low and hoarse, loaded with desire. "You have no idea how long I've waited for this." Before I could respond, he kissed me again, this time with more urgency. The kiss became hungrier, wetter, more intense. One of his hands slid down, gripping my thigh over my skirt, moving slowly up the side of my body as if wanting to map every curve. My hip instinctively moved against his, seeking more friction, and the moan he released against my mouth was pure sin. We were dangerously close to not being able to stop. My body burned, his blazed. The air around us seemed hotter, denser, charged with promises neither of us had verbalized yet. He pressed me against the wall with the weight of his body, his mouth descending to my neck, leaving a trail of hot, wet kisses that made my eyes close, and a trembling sigh escape my lips. His teeth lightly grazed the sensitive skin just below my ear, and I arched against him, my nails digging into the back of his neck. We were almost there, almost at the point where words would no longer be necessary, almost at the moment when reason would surrender completely to the desire that had consumed us for months. Then the door was broken down. The sound was sharp, violent, completely out of place. Wood giving way, metal hitting the wall. I pulled back instinctively, and Cale had already turned before I processed what was happening, his body between me and the entrance to the room in a fraction of a second that revealed an instinct that didn't match any version of CEO I had built in my head. 4 men, 5, all in black, all with the same coordinated movement of people who had done this before, who knew exactly the apartment's layout, and the position of each person inside it. Leave, whom I hadn't realized was in the apartment, in a side room, appeared from the hallway and tried to react, but there were 2 men waiting for exactly that. I froze. Cal didn't shout, didn't try to negotiate. He stood completely still with that specific quality of stillness that isn't passivity, it's calculation. His eyes swept the environment with a speed and coldness I had never seen in him, and that didn't match any 34-year-old fintech CEO I knew. 2 men immobilized him by the arms. He didn't resist. And then I understood, by the way they held him, not with uncoordinated violence, but with the precision of people following a specific order, that they hadn't come to steal anything. They had come to take him. Chapter 4. What You Didn't Know About Him. The plane was private. I had processed a lot in the last 40 minutes. The broken door, the men in black, Liev immobilized in the hallway, my own hands shaking while one of the men gestured that I should walk. But the plane was the detail that wasn't fitting. Private planes had owners, had destinations, had logic behind them that I still couldn't see. And the lack of that logic was more frightening than anything that had happened since the door gave way. Cale was sitting across from me, on the other side of the cabin's narrow aisle, free. The men hadn't put anything on him. No handcuffs, no physical restraints, which was another piece that didn't fit. He was looking out the window with that same closed expression as always, except now there was something beneath it that I had never seen in him before. It wasn't fear. It was older than fear. It was the kind of expression of someone who recognizes a path they spent years trying not to walk down again. Liev was somewhere in the rear of the aircraft, alive, apparently unharmed, but equally silent. I waited until the men withdrew to the forward section before speaking. "Where are we going?" He turned his eyes from the window to me. It took a second, not because he was thinking about the answer, but because he was thinking about how to give it. "Sicily," he said. The silence that followed was the kind that occupies the chest, not just the air around it. "Sicily," I repeated. "Italy, south." "I know where Sicily is, Cale." He nodded slightly, as if that was all there was to say on the subject, and went back to looking out the window. I watched him for a few seconds. The line of his jaw, the shoulders that hadn't relaxed since the apartment, the hands open on his knees with a tension that only appeared in the knuckles if you knew where to look. "You're going to explain to me what's happening," I said. It wasn't a question. He was silent for a time that was long enough for me to start thinking he wasn't going to speak. Then he took a deep breath, slowly, and turned his face to me with that new quality in his expression, of someone about to open a drawer he'd kept locked for 15 years. "My full name is Kyle Aldo Ferrante." He was silent for a moment, as if the name itself needed to land before anything that came after. "My father is Don Aldo Ferrante, head of the Ferrante family. Sicily, 3 generations. Territory, political influence, money laundering through wineries and construction." I processed each word with the care of someone disarming something. He spoke with the objectivity of a board meeting, which made the content even harder to hold. "You left," I said, "at 19. Came to New York with nothing, without the name, without the money, without asking him for anything." A short pause. "I built everything from scratch, because it was the only way to prove, mainly to myself, that I could exist without being Ferrante." The plane hit slight turbulence. Neither of us moved. I wanted to ask why. Why someone abandons a name, a family, an entire inheritance, and rebuilds everything from scratch in a city that owes nothing to anyone. But there was something in the way he looked out the window that told me the answer was coming, and that when it arrived it would have a weight I needed to be still to receive. I had a younger brother. He stopped, not for lack of words. Kyle Ferrante never stopped for lack of words. He stopped because there was something in that sentence that needed space before the ones that would come after. Marco, 15 years old. The voice didn't change in volume, but it changed in texture. It became denser, like something passed through a filter before being released. There was a territorial war. Marco had nothing to do with it. He was too young. Still outside the operations, but he was in the wrong place. A pause. I was there. I saw. 3 words. The plane kept flying. I said nothing, because there was nothing I could say that wouldn't be smaller than that silence. It was Cale who spoke again. After a time I couldn't measure. That night I decided I didn't want any part of that world, and I left. My father never forgave me. I never needed him to forgive me, because I didn't intend to come back. His eyes returned to me. With that calm I was beginning to understand wasn't absence of feeling. It was the way he carried too much feeling. But he's dying. Cancer. Advanced stage. Less than 6 months. And he won't accept dying without leaving a Ferrante successor in command. He sent Savio Greco, the consigliere, his right-hand man, to arrange my arrival. I listened to everything without saying a word. When he finished, I asked the only thing that had been in my head since the plane took off. And me? Why am I here? Something passed across his face. Quick, almost imperceptible, but it was there. You were seen with me, he said. Weeks working together, last night's dinner. Whoever organized this knew who you were before you entered that apartment. If you stayed in New York without protection, you'd be in danger. A pause. I didn't ask them to bring you, but when I found out they were going to leave you behind without any coverage, I said you were coming with me. I processed this information carefully because there were 2 ways to interpret it, and I needed to be sure which was the real one before reacting. So I'm here because you decided I was in danger, and that the solution was to bring me to Sicily without asking me anything. Yes. Without warning. Without explaining. Without considering that I might have an opinion about this. The plane was taking off in 40 minutes. There wasn't time for an alignment meeting. If the circumstances were different, I would have found that funny. I didn't. I want to go back, I said. Not yet, Kyle. Not yet, Vesper. The tone wasn't harsh, but it was final. The way some doors close, without noise but without margin. When the situation is under control, you go back. I guarantee that. I looked at him for a long time. He returned the look without looking away, without apologizing, with that irritating patience that must have a limit somewhere, but that I still hadn't found. Do you have family who needs to know you're okay? He asked afterward. You can let them know. Say you had to travel for work for a few weeks, that everything's fine. He handed me a phone. Not mine, but an unlocked one. I forgot to arrange this before. Sorry, I forgot. As if he had forgotten to include an attachment in an email. The plane had Wi-Fi, so I recorded a video and sent it to my mother. Brief, and in the most natural tone I could manage. Then I notified Pippa, sent a video of myself and a message, because Pippa was the person who was going to notice my disappearance with the most speed and least silence. Had to travel urgently for work. I'm fine. I'll explain later. The response arrived in 45 seconds. Travel where? With who? Vesper Adler. Are you with the hot guy? I looked at the message, then at Kyle, who was back to the window, oblivious to the digital panic unfolding on the phone he had lent me. Can't talk now. I'm fine. Can't talk. Vesper. I'm calling Interpol. I turned off notifications and returned the phone to the seat beside me. Mine was somewhere in New York. In the apartment maybe. Or in the purse that had been left in Cale's apartment when the door gave way. I hadn't stopped to think about this until now, which said something about the state I was in. In New York, there was an apartment with plants that needed water every 3 days. There was a gym with automatic debit on the 1st of the month. There was a report I had promised to deliver on Friday, and that was now in the limbo of a corporate server that technically belonged to Cale Ferrante. The same Cale Ferrante sitting a meter away from me on a private plane heading to Sicily for reasons I was still processing. The job. I had a job, with a schedule, with scheduled meetings, with an entire floor of people who were going to notice my absence Monday morning. I had told Pippa it was a work trip, which was technically true if you were very generous with the definition of work, and completely ignored the kidnapping part. How long? That was the question I couldn't stop asking, and for which there was no available answer. Kyle had said when the situation is under control, with the tranquility of someone announcing a weather forecast. No number, no deadline, none of the coordinates I used to organize existence. I was a person of coordinates. Of spreadsheets and deadlines and post-its with capital letters. And at that moment the only thing I had was a plane window, the silence of a man who had decided for me without asking me, and a phone that wasn't mine. The plants were going to die anyway. There was nothing I could do about that now. The Ferrante mansion was in the hills south of Palermo, in the kind of landscape that looked painted. Ancient stone, olive trees, the sea in the background at a distance that made everything quieter than it should be. The entrance was a wrought iron gate that opened onto a long driveway, flanked by cypresses, and the main building was large without being excessive, the way things are when wealth is old enough not to need to prove anything anymore. I arrived as Kale Ferrante's companion, which was how Liev had described me to the men at the entrance when the car stopped, and I had decided not to analyze what exactly that meant in that context, because there was a limit to what I could process in 12 hours. Don Aldo Ferrante received us in the main room, 68 years old, sitting in a high-backed chair like someone who hadn't learned any other posture in life, with a face that must have been imposing before the illness wore it down. There was still something there, in the bones, in the way the eyes moved, that made it clear this was a man accustomed to having things done his way. He looked at Kyle with the expression of someone expecting the arrival of an important document, not a son. Then he looked at me with the expression of someone evaluating an element he hadn't requested and still didn't know if it was useful. "She stays in the East Room," he said, in Italian, without addressing me directly. Kale didn't respond. He stood with that calculated stillness, the two measuring each other with the silence of people who have too much history to need words in the first round. On the other side of the room, a man I hadn't noticed stood up from an armchair and approached. Savio Greco, elegant, 50s, with the kind of composure that comes from decades practicing how to seem more trustworthy than anyone in the room. He extended his hand to me with a smile that was kindness in form and evaluation in content. "Savio Greco," he said, in fluent Portuguese, with an accent that mixed Italian and something I couldn't identify. "Consigliere of the family." "Welcome, Miss Adler." His eyes went over me with discreet care, the kind that registers everything without seeming to register anything. "It's an honor to have you here." "Thank you," I said, because it was the safest answer. He nodded, turned around, and went back to Don Aldo's side with the naturalness of someone who has occupied that space for so long, they no longer need to ask permission. That's when the third man in the room moved. He had been leaning against the wall near the window, with a glass in hand, and that air of someone who arrived before everyone else and doesn't intend to leave early. 38 years old, broad shoulders, the kind of face most people would find handsome until they noticed what was in the eyes, which wasn't warmth at all. Drago Vitale, I discovered later, was the son of the rival family's boss, there in a negotiation that seemed diplomatic on the surface, and that I still didn't have enough vocabulary to understand underneath. He walked in my direction with a smile that had calculated charm in every millimeter, looking at me the way some men look when they're deciding the value of something before making an offer. "Drago Vitale," he said, in English, with the intonation of someone accustomed to their own name producing some effect. "And you are?" "Vesper," I said. "Vesper." He repeated the name as if he were tasting it. Then he turned his eyes to Kale, who was completely still in the center of the room, with that statue quality he acquired when he was angry and didn't intend to show it. "Interesting choice of company, Ferrante." Kyle said nothing. Drago took one more step closer, not to me, to Kale, and said something in Italian with a smile on his lips that didn't reach his eyes. The voice was low, but I managed to follow enough to understand the structure of the sentence. There was a deal on the table, there were conditions, and there was my name in the middle of it, said with a lightness that made everything more sinister than if it had been shouted. He was offering me as part of a negotiation, bargaining chip, pressure element, something useful in an equation I hadn't asked to be part of. Then he looked at me once more, with that evaluation that didn't bother to disguise itself, and went back to where he had been leaning. Kyle remained still for a second that lasted longer than it should. Then, without looking at Drago, he said 3 words in Italian with a voice I had never heard in him, low, controlled, and absolutely devoid of his usual elegance, like something said from the inside out, without filter, without performance. Later, when we were in the hallway and Savio passed by us on his way to another wing of the mansion, I caught up to him in 2 steps. "What did he say?" I asked. "Low, Kyle." What were those 3 words? Savio looked at me for a second with those eyes that seemed to always be 2 steps ahead of any conversation. Then he tilted his head slightly in my direction and said, with the voice of someone transmitting completely ordinary information, "Sul mio cadavere." A pause. "Over my dead body." He kept walking. I stood in the hallway of the Ferrante mansion, with Sicily outside, and those 3 words echoing in a way that had too much weight for their size. Chapter 5. Sicily was never about business. Drago Vitale had a specific talent for showing up at moments when Kyle wasn't there. It wasn't coincidence. It took me 2 days to understand that. 2 days of running into him in the mansion's hallway, in the garden, on the lunch terrace, always with that calibrated smile, and always when Kale was in some meeting with his father, or with the family men who came and went in dark cars with a regularity I had learned not to comment on. Drago talked to me with the lightness of someone who has no specific intention, which was exactly how I knew he did. Kyle noticed on the 3rd day. "You're not going to the garden this afternoon," he said, in the morning, while I was having coffee in the kitchen of the wing where we stayed. I lowered my cup. Excuse me, Drago is in the garden this afternoon. You stay in the East Wing. I looked at him for a second with the patience of someone counting internally before responding. Kale, I'm a 26-year-old adult who has autonomy over where she goes inside a house. Not this house. Not this. This house has rules you don't know yet. And Drago Vitale is a danger you don't know how to evaluate. His voice was flat, without irritation, which was somehow worse than if there had been irritation. I'm not asking. I'm informing. Oh, I picked up the cup again. You're informing. How convenient. Vesper, you brought me here without asking me, installed me in a wing I didn't choose, and now you're telling me where I can and can't go inside this property as if I were an item that needs to be kept in the right place. I deposited the cup in the sink with a sound that was louder than I intended. I understand there's danger here. I understand Drago has intentions that aren't good, but I'm not your property, Kale Ferrante, and you treating me like I am doesn't keep me safe. It just keeps me angry. He was silent for a moment. His eyes were on me with that contained intensity, and there was something beneath the composure, a small fracture, almost invisible, that I couldn't identify in time before he spoke. I'm trying to keep you alive, he said. Just that. I opened my mouth, closed it. He left the kitchen before I found any answer worth giving. That night's dinner was a social obligation of the mansion. Donaldo, Savio, Drago, some family men, and the two of us. Long table, candles, the kind of meal that feels like protocol even when it's called informal. I had decided, in the hours between the morning argument and dinner, that I was tired of being managed. It wasn't heroism or recklessness. It was the natural limit of a person who had spent her entire life making her own decisions and who had been behaving for days, as if she needed permission to exist inside a space. When Drago, seated 3 places to my right, asked me a question about New York during dinner, I answered. One answer. Polite, brief, with no warmth at all, but an answer. Kyle's fork stopped for half a second. Just half a second. Anyone not paying attention wouldn't have seen it. But I had been paying attention for weeks. And I saw. Drago smiled and asked another question. I answered again, shorter this time, and returned my eyes to my plate. On the other side of the table, Kale was completely quiet with that specific quality of quietness that wasn't relaxation. It was the containment of something being kept inside with deliberate effort. Then Drago leaned in slightly and said, with his voice low enough to seem like a side conversation but loud enough that Kale certainly heard, "You're much more interesting than I expected for Ferrante's companion Vesper." The silence that settled in that corner of the table was immediate. And then Liev, who was standing near the side buffet, trying with all evidence to be invisible, moved his arm at a slightly wrong angle and knocked over an entire tray of red wine. The sound was immense. The wine went in 3 directions. 2 of the family men stood up by instinct. Don Aldo raised his eyes with an expression that could kill plants. Liev stood in the middle of the devastation with that expression of someone who can't believe he did this again. And it was exactly at that moment, in that silence that followed the chaos, with all eyes turned to the tray on the floor, that Kale turned to Drago and said, with a voice I had never heard in him before, low, stripped of any elegance, without his usual irony, and without the filter he used for everything, "She's not a companion." A 1-second pause that weighed more than the entire tray. And if you address her with one more word in that tone, "This will be the last meal you have at this table." Drago didn't respond. He kept looking at Kale with that expression of someone who's recalculating, and there was something in his eyes, beneath the charm and arrogance, that seemed genuinely surprised, as if he didn't expect the limit to exist, as if he had bet it didn't exist. Liev began collecting the glasses with a dedication that seemed like penance. After dinner, I went to my room. Kyle showed up 10 minutes later and closed the door behind him. I was standing near the window. Sicily outside was dark and quiet, the kind of landscape that seems to be in no hurry at all, and when I turned to face him, what I saw on his face disarmed me before any words. It wasn't anger. I had prepared myself for anger, for the controlled, elegant version of it he used when he wanted to make it clear he was dissatisfied. But what was on his face wasn't that. It was something else, deeper, more uncomfortable for him than any anger would be. It was fear. "I know you're angry with me," he said, with a voice that had lost its polished layer, "for bringing you here without warning, for trying to control where you go, for treating this as if you don't have an opinion about your own life. I know." He stood in the center of the room without approaching, with that posture that remained upright, but had lost its usual rigidity. "But Drago Vitale has spent 15 years trying to find a weakness in me that works, and you're the first real thing I've had in a long time, Vesper. The first." And the idea that he could use that. He stopped. He ran his hand through his hair, a gesture I had never seen in him, small and completely human, and was silent for a second that had too much weight for its size. I crossed the room. I didn't say anything. I just went to him, placed my hand in the center of his chest, and felt him breathe for a moment. The rhythm slightly altered from normal, the tension in the muscles beneath his shirt, and understood, with that clarity that sometimes arrives without warning, that I had been running from something that never had the slightest intention of hurting me. I didn't say any of that out loud, not yet. There were things that needed to be felt before being named, and I had learned in recent days that some truths stay more whole when you carry them a little before delivering them, but I stayed there, with my hand on his chest, feeling his heart faster than it should be, and I didn't move. He covered my hand with his, without saying anything. No rule in the world would have withstood that. The next day, Kyle summoned Drago to a private meeting. I wasn't present, but Liev told me afterward, with the economy of words that was his natural form of communication, that it had lasted 11 minutes, that Kyle had presented, with the precision of someone who prepared each sentence, why Vesper Adler was not a bargaining chip, was not an element of agreement, and was not an option in any equation involving the Vitale family now or at any other time. That Drago had tried to argue once. That Kale had responded with 2 sentences that Liev didn't repeat, but that clearly had closed the subject. That Drago had left the room angry, but had left. That afternoon, Kyle found me in the hallway of the East Wing and walked beside me in silence for a few steps before speaking. "I want you to be my girlfriend," he said. Without preamble, without build-up, without any flourish the sentence could have had if he were another type of person. I stopped walking. "Is this how you always get girlfriends?" I asked, without asking. "I don't usually have girlfriends." I looked at him. He returned the look with that same expression as always. Closed. Impossible, but there was something in his eyes I was beginning to learn to read, something that appeared only in moments when he had given up control long enough for me to see what was underneath. I laughed. He didn't laugh, but his eyes did something I had never seen in them before, something that didn't have a name yet, but that I knew I would learn. His room in the mansion had ancient stone walls, and a wide window that looked out onto the hills, and Sicily outside was dark and beautiful in that way only very old things can be. He closed the door with a soft click that seemed to echo louder than it should. I was standing in the center of the room, still with that remnant of tension circulating through my body. It wasn't anger. It was everything that had happened in recent days still boiling under my skin, with nowhere to go. When he crossed the space between us, there was no rush in his steps. There was never rush in him. There was only that quiet, absolute certainty that I already knew too well. And this time, I didn't try to resist. When he placed his hands on my face, exactly like in the elevator, his thumb sliding slowly below my chin, and his fingers settling along the line of my jaw, I felt the temperature of his skin against mine, hot, almost feverish, and I thought, completely irrationally, that there was no point of return anymore, that there probably hadn't been since the day I fainted in the office, and woke up with him sitting 4 meters away, asking in that calm voice if I wanted water. He kissed me slowly, slower than any time before, with that devastating patience that was his trademark, because it gave time for me to feel every detail, the light brush of lips, the way he tilted my head exactly how he wanted, the way his breathing mixed with mine. His hands descended down my shoulders, traced my waist, and pulled me closer with a calm firmness, without needing force. I was already going in that direction before he even asked. "Vesper," he murmured near my ear, his voice hoarse, stripped of its usual polished layer. It was the rawer version of him, and for that reason it sounded even more dangerous. Was all I could respond. A low sound, almost a moan, completely humiliating, completely honest. He undid the first button of my blouse with an almost cruel calm, deliberate, precise, in no hurry at all. The fabric opened slowly, revealing a piece of my skin. The cool air of the Sicilian night touched my collarbone like a cold contrast to the heat of his hands, which were large, warm, and descended with meticulous attention that made it impossible to think about more than one thing at a time. The second button gave way, then the third. Each movement was slow, intentional. His fingers brushed the newly exposed skin, tracing light lines that made my nerves wake up all at once. When the blouse finally opened completely, he slid his hands inside the fabric, palming them on my ribs, moving slowly up until he felt the volume of my breasts over my bra. His thumb brushed the still-covered nipple, a light touch that even so drew a trembling sigh from me. I pulled his shirt out of his pants with less elegance than he had demonstrated, which made a slightly comic sound, and he stopped for half a second with something in his eyes that was the closest thing to a smile I'd seen in him in weeks. Not on his lips, just in his eyes, that internal version he didn't let out completely. "I can help," he said. "I've got it," I said. He let me. But his hands went to my waist anyway, guiding without commanding. And when he laid me on the bed with that controlled weight above me, his arms supporting his own body, his entire attention on me with that quality of absolute concentration he had for everything he considered important, I understood that this was also something he considered important. He stopped for a moment, his face inches from mine, his breathing heavier than normal, but his eyes completely present, completely clear. "That day at the office," he said, with his voice low enough to seem like something said only for me, even though there was no one else in the room. "When you laughed in the hallway with someone from the team, I was in the office, the door ajar. I stood there listening for about 3 minutes without realizing it. A pause. That's when I knew. I looked at him. There was something in that revelation, small, precise, completely stripped of drama, that arrived in a different way than anything he had said before, because it wasn't about desire, it was about laughter. It was about the most banal and most real moment between us, long before any kiss, long before the elevator and dinner in Sicily. You should have said something, I said. I know. He descended to kiss me again, and this time there was something different in the quality of the kiss, deeper, without the previous containment, like a door that finally opened all the way. I'm saying it now. His mouth found mine with a pressure that gradually intensified, as if every second were a discovery. His tongue slid against mine in a slow, almost lazy rhythm, contrasting devastatingly with the urgency I felt in his hands cupping my face. It was a leisurely kiss, deep and deliberate, undoing me more completely than any rushed touch ever could. I pulled him by the nape of his neck, fingers tangling in his hair, and he responded by deepening the kiss even further. For an instant, the entire room vanished. All that remained was the heat of his mouth, the rhythm of his breath, and the sensation of being completely claimed. When he moved down, it was with a torturous and delicious slowness. His lips first grazed my neck, leaving a trail of hot, damp pressure. I felt his teeth lightly brush the sensitive skin, a subtle warning that made my whole body respond with a deep shiver. He descended past my collarbone, tracing the center of my chest with kisses that seemed to etch his presence into every inch. My belly came next, and every touch was intentional, as if he were mapping a territory he intended to know by heart. My hands were lost in his hair, and my breathing had already become irregular and hitched by the time he reached my hips. He looked up at me then, his dark, intense eyes seeking confirmation. I didn't need to say a single word. The yes was written all over my body, in the way my fingers tightened slightly against the back of his neck, in the way my gaze held his. When his mouth finally closed over my most intimate part, it was with a precision that drew a shaky sigh from me. I squeezed my eyes shut, fingers curling into the sheet. He learned my body with an almost unfair speed, or perhaps he already knew it intimately, which was even more devastating. His tongue moved with cruel patience, finding the exact rhythm, the perfect pressure. The damp heat concentrated exactly where I needed it most. Every movement was deliberate, unhurried, as if he wanted to savor my surrender. I involuntarily arched my back, and he, with his palm flat against my abdomen, held me firmly in place with delicate strength. He didn't allow me to escape the intensity. He continued, relentless in his sweetness, until my legs trembled, until the sounds escaping my throat lost any vestige of control, until I was right on the edge of coming apart. And then, at the most cruel and perfect moment, he stopped. He moved back up my body with that same deliberate slowness, and positioned himself over me. The entry was slow, almost reverent. Every inch was a full sensation, registered with an intensity that demanded my body open up and adjust to him. It was a complete filling, a fit so perfect that there was no room left for anything else. When he finally reached the bottom and paused, just breathing, with his forehead resting against mine, I felt that he too was struggling to maintain control. The moment was almost sacred in its intimacy. Then he began to move. What started as something controlled and measured gradually lost its edges. The rhythm deepened, fueled by the urgency growing in both of us. My legs wrapped around him, pulling him deeper with every thrust. The sounds of the room, our intertwined breaths, the slight creak of the bed, the low moans that neither of us could contain anymore, became the only existing reality. The climax found me like a wave that doesn't ask for permission. It started at the exact point where our bodies joined and expanded in surging waves, invading every nerve, every thought. I closed my eyes, abandoned any remnant of control, and shattered completely in his arms. He kept moving through my pleasure, holding me firmly, prolonging every tremor. Only when I felt his body tense against mine, his forehead still pressed to mine, and one last deep, possessive movement, did he give in as well, finding his own release in the same abyss as I did. We grew quiet. The room slowly returned. I fell asleep in his arms. The night was quiet. Outside, Cicely slept beneath a dark and beautiful blanket, and there was something in that quietness that seemed to resolve everything, as if the air itself knew that all tensions had finally found the place where they should rest. Before surrendering completely to sleep, a small memory, almost insignificant, surfaced in my mind. On the night we arrived at the mansion, Savio Greco had said goodbye to me in the hallway, with that fluent Portuguese and his usual calculated smile. "Welcome to the family, Vesper." At the time, I had interpreted it as a kind gesture, just the formal, elegant way a man like him said goodnight. But now, wrapped in the silence of the night and the comforting weight of Cale's arm over my body, that phrase echoed differently, deeper, more loaded. He hadn't said, "Welcome to the mansion." He hadn't said, "Welcome to Sicily." He said, "Welcome to the family." I smiled to myself in the dark, thinking it was just his traditional way of speaking. I closed my eyes and let exhaustion pull me down like a warm, pleasant current. Kyle breathed slowly beside me, his chest rising and falling in a calm, heavy rhythm of sleep. The heat of his body against my back was like a living blanket, familiar and safe. His scent, a subtle mix of leather, salt, and something uniquely his, enveloped me completely. Everything was okay. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to truly believe that. I didn't know, in that moment, how much weight that simple phrase carried. I didn't know that, In the world of the Grecos, the word family was never said casually. It wasn't mere kindness. It wasn't empty courtesy. It was a sentence. And I, without realizing it, had just accepted it. Outside, the light wind of the Sicilian night made the olive tree leaves whisper against the window, an almost imperceptible sound, almost sweet, almost like a warning. Kyle murmured something unintelligible in his sleep and pulled me even closer, burying his nose in the curve of my neck. I sighed, happy, and surrendered to his warmth. Tomorrow I would ask him the true meaning of those words. Tomorrow. But tomorrow, I didn't yet know, would arrive loaded with shadows that not even Kale's strong arms could keep completely at bay. For now, I slept and dreamed of olive trees whispering secrets I wasn't yet ready to understand. Lena here, that wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. The succession ceremony lasted 40 minutes. I had signed the documents, greeted the right men, said the words that needed to be said, everything within the plan. I looked at the place where Vesper was sitting. The chair was empty. I thought she had stepped out for a moment. I asked Liev to go check. He came back 2 minutes later with an expression I had never seen on his face, and then my phone vibrated. It was a message with no sender. A photo. Vesper, eyes closed, motionless, in a room I didn't recognize, and 3 words below, choose what matters. As you can see, that was just a little taste of book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on book 2. And since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.